All right, we are back. It's day two of the MSU Comics Forum, and we're here for our keynote scholar address from Dr. Deborah Whaley. Of course, it's a great honor for us to host Dr. Whaley at the MSU Comics Forum. We're very excited about her keynote. If for those of you, very few of you probably don't know, because Dr. Whaley is a very well-known scholar. Dr. Whaley is an artist, curator, and writer. She is a professor of African American Studies at the University of Iowa, and her course, her acclaimed book, Black Women in Sequence, Re-inking Comics, Graphic Novels, and Anime, explores questions of race and gender in the context of graphic novel production and comic book fandom. For this keynote today, Dr. Willow will be talking about Black Women in Sequence, rethinking and re-inking Black women in comics. As I say, this is a great honor for us to have her as our keynote scholar for the MSU Comics Forum, and I am personally looking forward to this address. So Dr. Whaley, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. One moment. Okay, how are we doing now?
You look good.
Okay, great. We see the presentation on the screen.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. I'm just so pleased to do this keynote. And my only regret is that I'm not physically in East Lansing, and all of the panels look so amazing. And I'm really looking forward to diving deep into the other panels that are going on today. Before I begin, I do want to just thank everyone who helped put this conference together. I know it's difficult to take a physical conference online, and there's so many things that goes into the technological aspects, and just sort of convening everyone together in this virtual space. And so, I have a lot of people on the screen who I'm wanting to thank here, from everyone who founded this forum, and of course, Professor Julian Chambliss, who invited me, and the graduate students who invited me as well, and all the sponsors of the MSU Comics Forum. I just want to thank you so much for bringing comics and comic studies to the public. I think a really special thing about this conference is it's really for everybody. It's for conference goers who are academics. It's for folks who are just interested in the field of sequential art and comics more broadly. And I think it's a really great idea to convene these various publics together. So thank you. And it's just wonderful to be here. So today I'm going to primarily talk about a book I published a bit ago called Black Women in Sequence, Re-inking Comics, Graphic Novels, and Anime, that focuses on the representation of Black women in a wide variety of sequential art forms. And so I'll talk a bit about that book as a sort of snapshot. I mean, I think some of you may have read it, some of you may have not read it. And so hopefully what I will say today will either, one, amplify and put a finer point on what you have read by just sort of going over some of the things that I think that book really tries to contribute to the field, into the conversation on comics. And for those of you who have not read the book, hopefully this talk will interest you in picking the book up. But I don't want to just stay with the book. I really also want to talk about some new directions that I'm going into in the field of comics, and some of the characters and titles and shows that I'm thinking about and that I'm writing about right now. And then I'm just excited to open it up to questions. So I think I'll talk for about maybe 40, 45 minutes, and depending on how time is going, we may look at some clips, especially some clips that focus on the kind of new direction that my work is going in comics, and then I'll hear from you all perhaps. So this is really exciting. So I come to this work as an artist, uh, and as a scholar and a researcher, educator, and what I call an Afro fan, a person of African descent. That's who I am, who is a reader and a viewer and a fan of various sequential art forms. And so on the left hand of the screen, I have a representation of some of the art that I do. And the only training I have had in art is actually in cartooning. And what's so interesting about that is, though I have training in cartooning, most of the art that I do is what you would consider mixed media art or fine art. So I don't do a lot of comics, but what I have on the left hand of the screen is just sort of a mixed representation of some of the art that I do. And in the far left panel, I have a representation of a recent comic that I did for the magazine Little Village for their January arts issue. And so that's just very squarely a comic. And then to the right of that, I have a representation of a acrylic painting that I did of two of the Boondocks characters from Aaron Magruder's The Boondocks. And so I have a painting here that I did of Huey and Jasmine. And again, this is an acrylic painting that I did. In the middle is a more recent piece that I did of the late George Floyd, who unfortunately was publicly executed this past summer. And so a lot of times what I do when I'm trying to think about something more deeply, if I'm wanting to venture into a writing piece and I'm not quite ready to write about it, a lot of times I'll do a painting. Sometimes I'll do a poem. I'm a poet as well. But in the case of this summer, I was just really thinking a lot about the altercation between law enforcement and everyday Americans. And so in the middle, I have this representation of George Floyd, who is in the back of him is an upside down American flag. And I mostly did the painting in red, white, and blue just to think about the kind of collide between national identity, blackness, patriotism. What does it mean to inhabit this space as a person of African descent, that perhaps sometimes not seen as fully belonging and as fully American, with all the rights that would go with that? To the bottom left of the screen, I have what I do a lot of, which is fine art. It's an oil painting. It's an abstract painting. So that's mostly the type of art that I do. And then finally, on the bottom right hand side, I have a mixed media piece, a painting that I did. And this is an oil painting, but it also has mirror tiles. And I like to do a mixture of both abstract art, again, sequential, more comic type of art. And then I like to do portraits as well. And I like to add other forms to the work to make it more interesting. So here at the bottom right, the sort of adding of the mirror tiles is a way to not only bring in that sort of mixed media aesthetic, but what I wanted to do is, as folks are looking at the painting, they're also through the mirror tiles looking at themselves, right? So for me, I did this painting to sort of provide a kind of self-reflexive viewing process. And so when I am creating art, I think a lot, not just about concept and aesthetic and form, but viewership, right? And what the spectator or viewer is bringing to the piece. And so this is the art that I do that informs the work and the writing in Black Women in Sequence. So to the right of your screen, I have a kind of snapshot of what I'm going to talk about today and the sort of arc of my book, Black Women in Sequence. And it's a book of 5 chapters, and of course, there's an introduction and a conclusion. But the book focuses again on the representation, the circulation, the narrative, the creatorship of Black women in comics. And so, what I tried to do in the book is really look at a wide range of media forms, especially because, to my knowledge, there really has not been a book on Black women in comics and sequential art. And so I had a large terrain to cover. And so one of the things you'll notice throughout this presentation is that this presentation is in the form of a comic book, and I will talk and you will view from left to right, from right to left, from top to bottom. You'll look at the page. I'll talk about the page all at once, and then I will focus on a particular panel at some points. And I do this because I wanted my talk to kind of replicate the experience of reading a comic book and to replicate the experience of what I call in my book as the optic cognitive. Which is to say, sort of thinking about the ways in which the eye and the mind is processing this form simultaneously in a very complex way. And so the arc of the book is that I start out talking about a cartoonist named Jackie Zelda Orme, who did work in the 1930s and the 1940s and 1950s, and then she became a doll maker. And I'll talk a lot more about all of these chapters in detail in a moment, but just to give you sort of a snapshot. And so I'm focusing right now on the right side, bottom right panel. There's a number 1 at the top, which lets you know I'm talking about the first chapter. And so in this chapter, I talk about comics as a form of news, as a form of the news of the day. Jackie Orme started out as actually a newswoman, as someone who worked for Black newspapers, and she really wanted to have the opportunity to be a serious journalist, and she was a journalist. But because of some of the restrictions of the time, she was not able to report in the ways that she wanted, although she did some amazing news stories, and to have the type of opportunities that she wanted to have. Even though she was working at Black newspapers, she still faced a gender glass ceiling. And so what she did is she ended up talking about some of the news stories of the day through her art, through comics. And I want to talk not just about the narrative of her work, but I also want to talk about the artistry too. And that's what I will do today. And so I look at her work in terms of what I have hoped to uniquely theorize as Black cultural front comics. And by that, I mean that she was able to talk about the things that concerned people of African descent with a finer point on or an attention to politics. And she was a part of this group of artists and activists of the time who saw art as a vehicle through which one might make an intervention. And I won't spend a whole lot of time talking specifically about Black Cultural Front comics, but you can read the book and learn more about that term and what that means and how it circulated over time. The other really great thing about Jackie Orms is that she blazed the trail, and her work is still so significant today. There is an organization called the Orm Society, a group of Black women comic artists and writers who see Jackie Orms as someone, again, who blazed the trail for them. And so I say that just to underscore the work that she did is still so relevant and important to people working in the field today. So she really did blaze a trail. And she did all of this work while being under surveillance by the FBI because she was an artist and she had an activist bent that had the work that she did because she talked a lot about political issues. She was seen at the time as a possible subversive. The United States FBI was concerned that she was a subversive, that she was a communist. And I won't delve a lot into that part. Again, I go much more deeper into that, into the book. But what I just want to say here is that she was creating these amazing comics while under surveillance by the United States, more specifically by the FBI. And so I add that to say, and for us to sort of think about, like, what does it mean to create while you're under, this type of pressure, but to still use your art as a vehicle through which you might communicate what that pressure means and looks like, and to not let it derail you from your larger focus of bringing to the masses these issues that concern people of African descent throughout the times. And so that's the first chapter. And then I move into a discussion of the character Catwoman. I look specifically at the 2004 film, but I also look at the graphic novel Catwoman. And right now I'm referring to the panel at the top right of your screen on the right hand side. And so I look at the graphic novel Catwoman, and I look at the comics, the Batman comics, and also the Batman television show. And I'll talk again more about that. But what I try to do in that chapter is to, one, just sort of think about what it means to be seen. And by that, I mean, when Eartha Kitt was, for those of you who don't know, the late actor Eartha Kitt played Catwoman in the Batman television show for a really short time in the 1960s. And so it was a really rare representation of Black women on television, of Black women in a really sort of main type of role of a Black woman also who had a sort of glamorous type of representation that you oftentimes didn't see because we were so often depicted as like mammies or, these kind of stereotypes, Jezebels, all these stereotypes of Black women. And Eartha Kitt as Catwoman kind of broke out of those stereotypes and allowed Black women to be seen in a way that we had not been seen. But I also talk in this chapter about, again, the 2004 film Catwoman. And, when I compare it to Eartha Kitt's Catwoman, a lot of what I'm interested in sort of thinking through is what does it mean when we have this film that was created to make a profit, right? So the creators of this film thought, okay, well, if we get the actor Halle Berry, who played Catwoman in this 2004 film, to sort of be the star, then, at the box office, this will be a success. And what we found is there was capitalist trouble, as I say, on the screen. It didn't work. The film did not do well for a lot of different reasons. But what I really focus on is this sort of like post-racial conundrum. On the one hand, they tasked Halle Berry to bring in a wide audience. But on the other hand, in the execution of the film, it was really kind of a post-racial fantasy that didn't really focus on her Blackness in a way that I think would really resonate with audiences. So it just didn't work. But despite that, there's been some exciting recent representations of Black Catwomen that I'll talk about, what I call the Afro fangirl's revenge. And so that's the second chapter. In the third chapter, I talk about characters who I think are, for a lot of people, will be characters that they will have heard about or heard of, or who have who audiences have read about or seen on the silver screen. And so in my third chapter, I focus on Storm from X-Men, but also she's had her own graphic novel title. And of course, she has appeared in the Black Panther comic books as well. And I talk about the character Vixen, who has appeared across a wide array of titles, including Suicide Squad, Justice League of America, Animal Man. She's had her own title as well. And then I also talk about the character Nubia, who was introduced in the comic book Wonder Woman, and she was sort of marketed as the Black Wonder Woman. And so in that chapter, I'm thinking about issues of colonialism in these various titles, the ways in which these titles tried to represent and talk about gender and feminism of the time. And again, I sort of begin talking about when these characters and titles first appeared, like in the 1970s. And so this is a time, where we have, feminism and women's rights at the forefront. And a lot of these titles tried to incorporate that sort of gender feminist politic into the narrative, sometimes in successful ways, and sometimes in not so successful ways. And I sort of call it funny feminism. And the main focus of that chapter, though, also is to think about why did authors and artists aim to imbue an African ethnicity into these characters? And when they did imbue this imagined ethnicity, in what ways was it more an imagined type of representation, really sort of detached from the reality of Africanism? And in what ways was it at times sort of useful for us to think about culture and identity in complex ways, especially in some of these titles like the late Eric Jerome Dickey's graphic novel Storm, where he talks about colonialism and intertribal conflict. He talks about colorism, and it's a really beautifully illustrated book. But the narrative is quite powerful as well, even though no title is perfect. There's some disruptive gender politics in the book, but nevertheless, it's a really great title to think about culture and ethnicity and colonialism. And then I moved through, and now I'm looking at the bottom left panel on the right hand side to talk about what I hope to theorize uniquely as Afro anime. And I look at the character Nadia from the anime, the 1990s anime, Nadia, the Secret of Blue Water. And I decided to write a chapter on this for a couple reasons. One, anime and manga is really a form that has affected American comics and American comic artists and writers, and there's so many fans of this form. And again, I wanted to talk about a wide variety of mediums and characters, and so I really wanted to have a chapter on anime. But this chapter allows me to talk about again this form of Afro anime. I'm sort of thinking through what does it mean when you try to incorporate various aspects of Black cultural politics into this Japanese animation form. And I sort of frame the chapter by thinking about the flows of Japanese popular culture, and also about women who cosplay as Nadia, and to just sort of take a deeper dive into fandom, to sort of think through the complex arena of cosplay. And what's unique about this character is because she is a woman of color, and many mark her as a character of African descent. You have very rarely women of color who can cosplay as a character who's more culturally like them. But I also, in this chapter, talk about anime and forms of manga that some sort of situate as being really close to the form of child pornography. And so this it was a really difficult chapter for me, but I wanted to talk not just about the amazing things that this anime show the 1990s does, but what does it mean when you have this character distributed as an action figure or as a representation on sites that some deem as pornographic. And because the character is represented as a young girl, things get really, really complicated. And so this chapter was an opportunity for me to talk about a wide variety of things. So let's talk a bit more about the first chapter, Jackie Arms. So Jackie Arms, known as the first Black female cartoonist to gain wide recognition, who did comic art in Black newspapers, the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, to be specific. She did three titles: Torchy Brown, From Dixie to Harlem, which was a migration narrative. And so I am looking now at the left hand side of the screen, and I have a representation of two of her comic strips done in the Pittsburgh Courier. And so Torchy was this character who moved from the South to the North, from Dixie to Harlem. And I said it's a migration narrative. And so what was so great about this comic is Arms was able to do a few things. One is to talk about what it meant at that time for people of African descent to make this move from the South to the North, and what were some of the class conflicts that came into play, what were some of the regional differences. Now, I should say that as amazing as her work is and was, and as amazing as I think she was, at the time she did have her critics. Some said that she overly stereotyped the South and Southern culture, and that at times her characters had a kind of minstrelsy type of narrative, especially when she was narrating the Southern characters. And so on the screen at the bottom, I have a representation where you see Torchy sort of writing back to her relatives in the South, and these Southern relatives are, talking in particular dialect that some may see as kind of stereotyped. And then on the left-hand screen at the middle panel, you see Torchy in her in Harlem and in her element of glamour and interacting with this male character. And so, there's a narrative of Arms that I think is so amazing in terms of her doing this work at this time. There's the great narrative of her work that looked at various issues of class and gender and race and politics. But I also really like to focus on the performativity of the illustration and to think about Arms as an artist. And you'll notice from these representations on the screen that she had this performative aesthetic where the characters were moving in a way that was really invoking motion, I think, uniquely. And I don't think we always consider comics, and particularly like comic strips, in terms of necessarily movement and performance. And so I just wanted to take the time to sort of amplify her artistic ability to recreate movement uniquely. And in so doing, so what? Why does that matter? I think it adds a really nice kind of dynamic layer to the comic form in terms of her illustrations. On the right side of the screen, I have two one-panel comics that she did. One, the far right, is this character Candy, who was domestic, and she looked a lot more like a pinup girl than she looked like a domestic. And Candy, done in the 1940s, was this character who would comment upon the war effort, on Black patriotism, on Black working class politics. She would answer back to the woman, that she worked for. And so why is this significant? Not only has the representation of Black female domestics been highly debased and stereotyped, but they have not always had a voice in various forms of media. And Candy had a voice. And she was, again, very glamorous, but also very smart, very funny, lots of wit. And she was this kind of voice of Black working class political consciousness that was just um, so rare. And then to the left on the right panel, I have a representation of Orm's comic, Patty Joe and Ginger. And this was also a one panel comic that Jackie Zelda Orms did, and it was focused on two sisters. One was a sort of very glamorous older sister, and then the very young Patty Joe. And so this comic was done in the 1950s, and it focused a lot on civil rights issues, on women in sport, on women, Black women particularly, being able to gain representation in public spaces. And so it really covered a wide terrain. But the wonderful thing about Orms, there's a great narrative, there's the beautiful art, there's the performativity of her aesthetic. But also, what was so great is that her comics were funny. And so she was able to talk about all of these issues with great humor and wit, which is, I think, not really, always easy to do. And again, the great thing for me in terms of her work is the ways in which she was able to talk about class across varied classes. What does it mean to come from more humble beginnings and sort of struggle, going from the South to the North? What does it mean in terms of Patty, Joe, and Ginger to be a part of the Black middle class, but still experience racism and segregation? And what does it mean to be working class? What does it mean to be a Black female domestic in the 1940s? And so she was able to sort of cover that really amazing large terrain. I mentioned that I have a chapter on Catwoman, and for me, I think what Black Women in Sequence tries to do is to talk about the ways in which the racialization of this character over time amplified meaning for readers. And so I look at the character when she was represented as white, as Latinx, and as Black. I'm really interested in what the fans had to say about all these different iterations of Catwoman. And so I spent a lot of time talking to readers of the graphic novel Catwoman, and I was able to talk about and talk to readers all across the globe, which is really exciting. And I think different iterations of Catwoman do different things. And so, what I find so compelling about the graphic novel, and I talk a lot about Ed Brubaker's graphic novel Catwoman, and as well as Minnie Newell's. I think they added a really complex psychological layer to the character. And I think another amazing thing about the character is its ability to represent various forms of sexualities, and to have this character who is very smart and powerful and an anti hero. The other thing that I focused on when I'm talking about the 1960s television show Batman and Eartha Kitt's rendition of Catwoman is the ways in which she was uniquely situated as this character who had these male alliances that she worked with. I mean, she was a villain, but what was so unique is that she was situated as a character who, again, had these alliances with these other male characters in the television show. And while the previous Catwomans and even the ones who came after her was a more kind of sexualized representation, and there was a sexuality to Eartha Kitt's Catwoman, but while the previous versions were, very sexualized, it's kind of interesting because of the sign of the times. We didn't have Catwoman in terms of Eartha Kitt's rendition, who was like the love interest of Batman, right? Because I think many would have seen that to be too controversial or dangerous for the times. But what came out of that sort of creepy, segregated type of fear in terms of not having the Black Catwoman and Batman as a sort of kind of love interest aspect that we had in other forms is that she was able to be somewhat of like an equal colleague with some of the male villains in the show. And the other thing that I really try to focus on is how Eartha Kitt as an actor, how her politics and activism outside of the show, what that meant in terms of the representation in the show, and just sort of like thinking through and about her as an actor and being kind of a forerunner in television, but also a forerunner in politics off of screen. And I also talk a bit about Catwoman in video games, both Black representations of Catwoman in video games, as well as what I call the gender trouble of the video game Arkham City. And sometimes people ask me, because I sort of started with this chapter thinking through the failure of the 2004 Catwoman film. What did I like about the 2004 film? Well, one of the things I liked is the very thing that caused the film to be a failure, which is that they thought, if they have Catwoman as Halle Berry, that it would be this great box office success. I like the fact that we had this film that starred a Black female superhero, and had a Latinx male character. I like the kind of romantic entanglement of the two characters. And as an American Studies scholar, I have to say, I really like the fact that it was an American Studies professor in that film who originally sort of brought her to the history of the cat and the legend of Catwoman. So that was really exciting. On the right hand of the screen, I have some more recent representations of Catwoman in comic books, especially Catwoman as Black, and especially comic books that use the Eartha Kitt likeness in comics and graphic novels. And I have two versions here. One that at the top specifically focuses on Catwoman as a character, and it's kind of really directed towards a younger audience. And she's this sort of surfer, riot girl Catwoman character. It's a lot of fun. And at the bottom, I have a 2013 representation of Catwoman in the DC universe. Again, she has that Eartha Kitt likeness. She's not the kind of cool hero that we see at the top of the panel with the younger version. She's back to her sort of villainous ways and kind of cray cray, a little bit crazy. But I think that's okay, because not all, I think that it's problematic to think Black representation has to sort of emote this paragon of virtue to be interesting and to be politically useful. It's very fine to have characters who are villains or who are anti-heroes. I mentioned before, and I'm looking right now at the left-hand part of the comic book, that I talk about Storm and this character Nubia from Wonder Woman, and also Vixen. So I have some visual representations here. And so I mentioned that, in this chapter, I think a lot about the sort of African ethnicity that was imbued into these characters. But I also use comics to think about US and African relations, and to interpret and to engage with the ways in which authors and artists talked about through these titles the relationship between US and Africa, and the ways in which, again, these characters became kind of signs or reference for Africa in unique ways and in problematic ways. How in some of these titles, especially Vixen, the title Vixen, and with the character Storm in X-Men, how some of these titles talked about intercultural or intertribal conflict. And so that allows an opportunity just to think about the diversity of, well, I was going to say African America, but I was going to say the diversity of people of African descent, like within that group. And I also delve into patriotism and how superhero characters, and this is not something that's new, so many people have written about this, how superhero characters engage with and become signs and reference for US patriotism. And for me to think about what does it mean to have these characters who are marked as African to be signs of US patriotism at particular moments, and just sort of thinking through what that means and what that does. Again, always talking about the narrative and the politics of these forms, but the art and the artistry. And so, again, if you just look at the left hand side of the screen, there's so many artists over time who have illustrated these characters in really beautiful ways. Now, I have to say early on, especially with the character Nubia from Wonder Woman, and I'm looking at top, the left page, but the top right, where you see a kind of a black Wonder Woman type looking character. That's Nubia, and a sort of black representation of Superman. Oftentimes, black characters, male or female or in between, were drawn really crudely. And so, at least in these representations, you see more attention to color and hair texture, and just representing a type of aesthetic that I think represents blackness in really compelling, aesthetically beautiful ways. And so, that is just to say the art matters, and thinking through what the inking and the coloring and the artistic form brings to the narrative, I think is always really important. The last thing that almost the last thing that I'll say about Black women in sequence is, and I'm looking at the right hand of the screen right now. I do talk about this character Nadia from Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water, but I contextualize it within thinking about just kind of like the cultural work of anime, and what does it mean now that we are at a moment where Black characters are entering into the anime form. And so here on the screen, I have some characters who are marked as, and many read as Black characters. And so what I try to do is to just think about, again, not just like, you know, Japanese popular culture and how that influences writers in the US and artists in the US, but like, what does it mean when Blackness circulates globally through the anime form? And how does that affect the ways in which people of African descent are represented and seen and thought about? So this is the last thing I will say about Black feminist sequence. One of the main contributions that I hope this book made is to think through some unique categories that women working today, or at least not so long ago, just thinking through these unique categories that Black women are working within, and the ways in which they're pushing boundaries. And so I talk about four, I guess five main sort of genres that they are breaking new ground with. Afro anime, this sort of conversion of the Japanese aesthetic in anime and manga and Black cultural politics. Another form I call Afro phantasmagoria, and again, I'm looking at the left hand side of the page with the background is pink. And for me, Afro phantasmagoria is just kind of a conglomeration of fantasy comics and Black culture, cultural politics, and aesthetics. And what does it mean when these two things collide? And I look at the work of Nara Walker, who I think does some really beautiful artistic work. And she does comics in this form of both Afro manga, but also what she calls visual poetry. And she also has a really kind of beautiful performative aesthetic with her characters. And so the other great thing about her work, and I have a representation in the middle of another artist as well, but who represents Black women in kind of unique aesthetic ways. So they have different hair colors, different skin colors, just the ways in which they are seen and visualized are ways that we oftentimes do not see. So they're able to really bring out that diverse aesthetic. And so if you kind of look at the five different visualizations I have, so I have a sort of Afro anime visual aesthetic I'm talking about, a narrative aesthetic, or I should say narrative form, Afro phantasmagoria. I also talk about music in comics and the ways in which Afro punk and post punk music is articulated or represented in comics as well. And that's the kind of the middle part of the screen that I'm showing. And then at the bottom, I talk about future parody and Afrofuturism and the ways in which Black women, comic artists, and authors imagine the future and the past and the present simultaneously to present narratives of colonialism, of politics, of conflict, of pleasure. And another contribution that I try to make is to think about comics as a kind of Black postmodern form. That's talking about gender and class and race and sexualities and the body and ableness simultaneously. So, what am I working on right now? Just to wrap up a bit, I'll talk for maybe another 5 or 10 more minutes, and maybe we have some time for questions and maybe some video. Right now, I'm really excited about the comic book adaptation in television, and I'm also really excited about web comics. And so, on the right hand of the screen, these are some characters and some titles that I'm writing on right now. I'm writing about the characters Thunder and Lightning from the comic and the television show Black Lightning. I'm writing about Fish Mooney from Gotham, and I'm writing about the second season of Batwoman, where we have a Black Batwoman, which is amazing. I'm writing right now about the character Friday Foster, who appears on the front cover of my book, but I really don't talk about Friday Foster in the book, and there's a lot of reasons why that is so. One is which I did want to have a chapter on Friday Foster, but the book was already a 5 chapter book, so I just kind of mentioned her. But I definitely wanted her on the cover of my book because she is the kind of first mainstream comic strip character in a mainstream comic that ran in the Chicago Tribune. But I'm writing now about the character Friday Foster, the whole run of the comic, and thinking about it in terms of romance comics. And I'm looking at a web comic called Dining with Dana, and also an adjacent comic done by Kaylin Pickens Rich called Dill Comics, and she uses Afro Goth music and culture as an entry point into talking about Blackness and to representing Blackness in her work. And I'm also writing about and thinking about the character Susanna Dean from the comic book adaptation of Stephen King's The Dark Tower. So with the what I hope to have been one of the first people to sort of coin as Afrogoth in comics and looking at this character Dining with Dana, a lot of the things that I'm talking about is the ways in which this artist and writer Kaylin Pickens Rich is able to talk about the Black female body. So she has characters who are voluminous in size, and that's not represented as problematic, that's represented as healthy. And how often do we see representations of Black people in goth music subculture? We really do not, but in this comic, we definitely do. And so she has this very voluminous Black female goth character, but her collaborator, or her, I don't want to call him a sidekick, but one of her other main characters is named Dill. And this is this Black male post-punk character who has a pink mohawk, and he is very activist focused. A lot of her characters are non-gender binary, which I think is significant as well. And so she's able to talk about music subcultures, about fat phobia, about phobias of Black people in punk culture. But she also uses this comic where she has these characters talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, talking about veganism, and it just really is a really fine representation of how you can intermix music subculture and the comic form, and to be able to present various forms of social, cultural, political, and gender commentary in unique ways, and to do it through web comics. And so that means it's available to the masses. And so I mentioned that I'm thinking about characters in the show Black Lightning. I am really interested in these Black female superhero characters in terms of, what does it mean, the two characters that I'm looking at, Lightning and Thunder. They are sisters, and they are these wonderful superhero characters, and they are they are struggling with how to enact their powers in ways that can intervene in urban communities. And so they're significant in so many ways. But I have in the thought bubble their father, Black Lightning, because I'm also thinking about sisterhood, but I'm thinking of Black fatherhood in this title as well, and the relationship between them and their father, which I also see as unique and very interesting too. Fish Mooney, again in Gotham, I'm looking at the comic books, but also the television show. And I think, Fish Mooney, she is a villainous type of character, which again, I think is just fine. But the also thing I find really interesting about Fish Mooney is the ways in which the other characters sort of struggle to see her as a leadership or an authority figure, and the ways in which through her kind of villainry, she tries to intervene in that. And so now I'm looking at the right hand of the screen at this new iteration of Batwoman, who's so exciting because if you all have not seen the show yet, I think they're on like maybe the sixth episode of the season. She is this Black working class woman. She's a superhero, but she's kind of an anti hero. She pushes sexual and gender boundaries, and we really have not seen on in television a character who identifies as a queer character very forcefully, and but that's a huge part of her characterization. But the show doesn't just kind of like stay there in her sexuality. It kind of moves through what does it mean to be a working class Black woman as well. So she's doing a lot of amazing cultural work. So I'm super excited to talk and to think about. And I'll just wrap up to say I'm thinking a lot about the character Iris West in the television show The Flash. And you'll notice with these kind of television characters, I'm squarely in the DC universe. And the great thing I like about Iris West is she is this character who kind of transitioned from a love interest and in some ways somewhat vapid. But what I really liked about her characterization is this kind of interracial coupling that she has, with other male characters, but more specifically with the Flash. And then also how she kind of moves from love interest to being a superhero herself. So there's this kind of growth arc with the character that I think is particularly useful. And I mentioned I'm looking at Stephen King's The Dark Tower and this character, Susanna Dean, in his work, specifically looking at the Black female body and ableness. She's a character who is an amputee, but she's still a character who's represented as a love interest, which we don't see a lot. But it's a very complex character. She has a lot of psychological layers. She's a character who suffers from disassociation. And so it's an opportunity to think about the psychological layers of a particular character as well as issues of sexual agency. And I mentioned that I'm also looking at the character Friday Foster, who I have represented on the left hand of the screen. And so and in that I'm thinking about issues of labor and romance because it is a romance comic that was done in the 1970s. I'm thinking about issues of class. But to conclude, some of the things that I just wanted to conclude and put a finer point on right now. I hope you will, if you have not purchased it already, I hope you will take a look at my book, Black Woman in Sequence, where you can find out a lot more about these characters. And also, I have a book coming out in June with Ramsey Fawaz and Shelley Strebe called Keywords in Comic Studies from NYU Press, which is a kind of analysis of various keywords in the field of comic studies. So that's coming out in June. I also do a couple webinars on teaching comics in the classroom and doing research in comics. So if you like what you've heard today and you'd like to hear more, but you want to hear more about, okay, well, how might I incorporate these things in my class, or how might I incorporate these things into my research, you can be in touch with me and book me for a webinar. And so thank you all so much. And I think we have this time for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Whaley. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions these last few minutes. One was on your terminology you outlined for areas that you're interested in, Afrofuturism, Afro. But the question is about, and I don't want to butcher the question, Afro from Yeah, I'm getting it.
Afro
I'm not getting it right.
Phantasmagoria.
Yes, yes, that's exactly it. That is
Yeah,
exactly it. And
great,
the
great.
question is, with that term, is there a genealogy of the genre with artists directly building on one another, or does it reemerge periodically?
Yeah, so in terms of origin reemerging, I'm not sure about that. But what I'm trying to do with the term is to look at titles that use the kind of phantasmagoria type of theme narratively, but also aesthetically, and how they make it relevant to the variety of Black experiences. And so I've talked a lot about phantasmagoria in film and the kind of use of uh, fantasy type of narratives in ways in which are unique and useful, and the ways in which some narratives are debased by kind of presenting an absurd sort of fantasy type of element into it. And so when I first started talking about phantasmagoria, I was talking about Spike Lee films. And so I was kind of playing around with it. And there's this huge literary genre field of phantasmagoria, right? Like as a theory and as a genre and all of that. That's just huge in literary theory and in theory just elsewhere. So when and where I enter is kind of trying to think through what happens when you have Black artists, creators, filmmakers, comic artists, etc., playing with the variety of the components within this narrative, and again, kind of infusing it with a Black cultural aesthetic. And so, I mean, I don't. Lots of folks. I mean, and I also don't want to make it seem like fantasy is equal to phantasmagoria, because phantasmagoria is a lot more complex than just saying, okay, it's just, it's like a fantasy narrative. That's part of it. But there's lots of other elements too that we don't have time to take a deep dive into right now. But if you're interested, I wrote a piece on Spike Lee's She Hate Me, where I talk really deeply about the components in phantasmagoria, and I talk a lot about it in the 5th chapter of my book. Um, and so I don't know, although there's lots of stuff on like fantasy comics and Black fantasy comics and futurity and the Black Fantastic, which was, a book that was so important to me. I couldn't have written my 5th chapter without the work of people like, Richard Eiton and others. But I hope to be one of the first people to kind of coin the Afro phantasmagoria as an idea. And so I hope that provides some information on, yes, there's this larger lineage, lots of stuff on Black fantasy, but I hope to be kind of one of the few people thinking through Afro phantasmagoria as a unique genre form. But you can look at my 5th chapter and learn a lot more, and look at my piece on Spike Lee's She Hate Me, which is an open source article that I published in the journal Portray.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. And there's a question here related to your focus in terms of the projects that you alluded to that are emerging around sort of the DC transmedia characters. Is 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 the DC choice because of the nature of the transmedia, or is it that you feel the Marvel characters are a different kind of transmedia enterprise?
Yeah, it's it's just by accident. And yeah, just because I want to talk about some television characters, and the ones that I find really interesting happen to be DC characters. And so that's it's just kind of by accident that the ones I'm talking about are all from the DC universe and television. But that allows me to kind of talk about Black DC women, which I think is going to allow me to do some kind of more specific work about DC in the Black female making, through this form.
Okay.
But I'm a
Well,
huge Marvel fan.
right, right.
I mean, there's
Well,
always
yeah,
DC Marvel wars.
right. Yeah. I'm sure there are people out there who like do write more on Marvel. But I'm sure that's also coming. I want to thank you. We scheduled this. We were here an hour keynote. So We're coming up on time and we're scheduling our break right now. But of course, this was incredibly illuminating. Again, thank you so much for being a scholar keynote this year for the MSU Comics Forum. There's thunderous rounds of virtual applause. You just can't hear them right now. But that was truly illuminating. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
All right, for those of you out there in media land, we are taking our break. We'll be back at 1:15 with our schedule next roundtable. And hold on, and we'll be right back.